Let's try to see if we can finish up this section with regard to how should I understand imputation, specifically with the issue of representative theory. Okay? Now, what we were looking at specifically was this issue of the seminal theory, And what we have done is to go back and contrast it with the representative theory. I want to try to finish up with the seminal theory because if you follow any argument to its logical conclusion, then you must be able to rest to the fact that you cannot have two parallel truths that annihilate each other. One truth cannot annul the other truth. Otherwise, then, you have no truth. And when you listen to the seminal theory, which is one that's very popular in many churches today, then you've got to arrive at that something is wrong or someone is wrong, but nothing adds up. Now you remember, and I want to go back to this. You remember when I said to you that 1 + 1 = 2. So you have one truth plus one truth equals 2. But you cannot have one truth minus another truth to equal 2. That's an act of impossibility. And if you follow this, now remember, this is based on truth. So let's go back to this. If we understand clearly what we're saying here in the seminal theory, now, and the way I had to contrast it is by coming back to the representative theory briefly. That's what I did here. Now let's see if we can come back and draw a conclusion, from Romans chapter 5, all right? From Romans chapter 5, verses 12 to 21, based on all of the conversation that we had in the last class. So I want to go back and look at verse 12 and 18, these two groups, and then look at verse 15, 17, and 19, just quick. I just want to remind us where we are, and look at what he says. Verse 12, therefore, just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, so death spread to all men because all sin. This is part of the first group. Now look at verse 18. So then, as through one transgression then resulted condemnation to all men. Now the key here is that in verse 12 and verse 18, it is clearly all men. That's why I said I had to go briefly back to representative theory, in order to contrast the seminal theory. But we're going to try to conclude the seminal theory with this. Now go and look at verses 15, 17, and 19. This is going to be the second group, where he says, but the free gift is not like the transgression, for by the transgression of the one, the many died. You see that? By the transgression of the one, the many died. Much more did the grace of the God and the gift by the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, abound to the many. Drop down to verse 17. For if by the transgression of the one, death reigned. You can see that. Drop down to verse 19. He says, for as through the one man disobedience, the many were made sinners. Even so, the obedience of the one, the many will be made righteous. Given that this contrast, let's conclude the seminal. And the way I was doing it was to show you briefly the representative. Now, I haven't finished with that yet, but I just want to get you there. So there is one conclusion to be drawn from Romans chapter 5, verse 12 through 21. At least one definitive conclusion we can come to. The only viable alternative to representative headship, listen to this very carefully, is that each person must be his own representative or stand on his own probation. Did you hear what I said? The only alternative, the only viable alternative to the representative headship theory is that each person has enough goodness in their own to stand on their own and stand on their own probation before God. This goes back to the issue of goodness, if you remember that. Okay? Aside from having no biblical support, theologically there could be no hope of restoration or salvation, because there is no way for individual sinners to save themselves. And that's the point. I was teaching at a Bible conference with a very large group of pastors in Africa. And as I was teaching through the subject of theology of the doctrine of sin, and this issue always comes up with salvation, and that is the merit of man or the non-merit of man. And when I came to this conclusion, when I came to this point, I said, well then, if the representative head theory is not what is being taught here in Romans chapter 5, and dubious at best is the seminal theory, then you have the only other alternative is that man can stand before God on his own merit, based on his own righteousness. And the problem with that is that the prophet Isaiah said that our righteousness is as filthy as rags. So you're going to have to explain to us on biblical terms, how did you arrive at that conclusion, given the history of your own preaching, given the history of your own teaching, the way you teach salvation is that you minimize sin. If each person, if each person is his own representative in probation and sin, which is what seminal headship boils down to, that's exactly what it boils down to, then he must also be his own representative in salvation. This, of course, is absolutely and totally impossible. Are you getting the idea why I went to this? If you are your own representative in sin and probation, you must be your own representative in salvation. And if that is true, given, you see, you haven't followed to its natural conclusion what you're saying. And that was the reason why we went through this very slowly. Now, I want to take you, does that make sense what I'm saying to you? Now, we're going to get into this a little bit more as we go along. But I just want to kind of give you the salient points, the highlights of this. Right? So you begin to see that perhaps not only should we be interested in the study of hamartiology, on the study of the doctrine of sin, but we ought to be interested in the teaching of sin. What does God actually say? I don't want to mix the two subjects up. So I want to go back and look at imputation now. And I'm going to take this out. And I want to go back now, because now here's where we're going to have to ask some basic questions. Okay? Again, notice that everything we're doing here in this introductory series on sin is that we're asking questions upon questions upon questions that will lead us, okay, to narrow down the scope of the subject outside of the realm of feelings, opinions, suggestions, recommendations, personal thoughts, and so forth. Okay? So I want to ask this question here, and that is, and we want to look at the extent. So let's look at it would help if I learned how to spell, right? The extent. Okay? I want to look at the extent of sin's corruption. Because this is going to take us back here. And what we're doing here is that we're eliminating the seminal theory. That's exactly what we're doing here. I think it's clear from the reading of the book of Romans chapter 5, which is the preeminent chapter on the issue, but I believe that it is clear. But in case not, then let's take another way to get to the same place. And here it is. What is the extent to which man is sinful? What is the extent to which man is sinful. Because remember, we eliminated the seminal theory. Because in the seminal theory, basically what it boils down to, after you get through all the fancy language and everything that they use, okay, and all the hyperbole that also gets thrown in here, you have to understand that the bottom line is that man is his own representative. And the problem is with that is that based on what? Where is man's merit so that he can become his own representative? Where is his merit that makes him his own representative? Where is that? So we have to then ask the question, what is the extent to which man is sinful? Because if he is his own representative, then sin is not in question. Sin has no impact whatsoever in the relationship between the creator and the creature. Thus, you have now blurred the distinction between the creator and the creature, and that's what we were talking about several classes ago. Once you blur the distinction between the creator and the creature, this is where we get into we are little gods theology. Now is this beginning to make sense here? Look at this. So we're going to have to look at, again, let's go back to imputation. Okay. We're going to go back to imputation, and we're going to look at now, we're going to call this the representative headship. And this is really the terminology that's used in the theological circles, because it's the best terminology they can come up with in the attempt to describe what that true relationship is between the creator and the creature, God and man. Now, we do recognize the concept of representative headship is found clearly in the book of Romans, chapter 5, verses 12 to 21. There is no argument about this. Not only is there, now we keep it in the realm of a theory, but we're drawing the conclusions out of the theological precepts that are laid down for us in the book of Romans in chapter 5, and specifically in verses 12 to 21, and in specifically in verses 12 and 18. We keep reading that over and over and over again, because in verse 12 he says, therefore just as through one man, there's federal headship, sin entered into the world, and death through sin, so the death spread to all men because all sin. Look at verse 18. So then through one transgression, then resulted condemnation to all men. There is the clear teaching of federal headship, that he is the federal headship representing us. That's what we would call representative headship. Adam. Let's begin to work this thing down logically, because I tell you, it just seems to be in this day and age today that if anything is logical, then it is not spiritual. And the problem with that is that one of the most logical books you're ever going to read in your entire life is going to be the Word of God. And that's what I want you to look at. So Adam, let's establish some facts here. At least the way the scriptures lays it out for us. Adam represented, okay? So we're going to look at Adam represented. Okay. Adam represented all mankind. In his sin. That's the point. He represented all mankind in his sin. This is exactly what he did. So, this is what we would get to, what we're going to call this guilt imputed. guilt imputed. Because of Adam's first sin, all mankind was plunged into suffering and death. It is what was called the judicial grounds whereby all men are charged guilty and liable for the penalty of sin. Adam was not the race which he sinned in the sense of the realistic seminal theory. But God contemplated, this is why we call it the theory, right? But God contemplated, right, the race in solidarity with Adam when he sinned, and thus they sinned in him. And we draw this out of Romans chapter 5, verse 14, where he says, nevertheless, death reigned from Adam until Moses, even over those who had not sinned. Are you seeing this? In the likeness of the offense of Adam, who is a type of him who was to come. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam until Moses. Now here's where we get it. Even over those who had not sinned in the likeness of the offense of Adam. So immediately we have to establish, right, that Adam represented all mankind when he sinned. This is where we get guilt imputed. Now remember, when we started this in the last class, we were asking the question about how is sin imputed and how is it transmitted. Remember that? Now let's get to the next point here. Right? Let's make this B, and we're going to call this Christ represented all born-again men the same way Adam represented all mankind. Christ is representing all born-again men, right, in his obedience. Now, in the first one, Adam, right, you can see now you can see why we're looking at this issue of representative headship, because I want to show you what the contrast is. Right? And what we see here clearly is that Adam represented all mankind in sin. This is what we would call guilt imputed. All right? Now, when we see here Christ represented all born-again men in his obedience, this is what we would call righteousness imputed. You see that? Righteousness imputed. You cannot have one without the other. That's an act of impossibility. So you need to understand this. So if the argument is, well, it's not my fault that Adam sinned, why should I have to pay for this deal? Well, but you think about that argument, because then the flip side of the argument is, well, then Christ died for you so that you don't have to die for yourself. And you go, well, let me see, maybe, well, you know, I like that deal. So you can't have one without the other. You cannot have one without the other. We need to be very clear about this. Okay? So now, the original sin of Adam and Eve, what did it produce? It produced what we would call universal guilt for all humans. Okay? So this is what we want to look at this. All right? So let's take this original sin, okay, of Adam and Eve. It produced universal, and now I really want to focus here, universal guilt. That's what it did. Universal guilt. Okay? For all humans. For all humans. That's what it did. Okay? Can you see the consequential actions of what we normally call in theology original sin? Can you see that? Okay. So now, this might appear to be unfair until we observe that God has countered that by extending the righteousness of Jesus to all who are regenerated by him. In either case, both groups, okay, whether Adam's group, Christ's group, if you want to put it that way, I want you to see that there's an exterior work taking place here. There's something that's external both to Adam, okay, and to Adam's descendants and to Christ's descendants here. When we're talking about the global output of sin. And so I want you to see that what you have, something that's external. This is the work of God taking place here. God initiates salvation. God maintains salvation. God is the one who executes salvation. So what happens is that the justified person is constituted righteous. This is exactly what is taking place here. How? By the obedience of Christ. By the obedience of Christ. Why? Because of the solidarity established between Christ and the justified person. And this is established via the believer's union with Christ. This is that again, I go back to what we spoke about in the last class, and remember we talked about the spiritual DNA. There is this union between Christ and man, between God and man. The same way there was that union between Adam and his progeny and his descendants. So this is where we get imputation taking place. So now, let's begin to narrow this down even more. Let's talk about the relation of imputation to this horrendous word that we hear a lot, and it's called depravity. Depravity. Let's look at this. Let's look at this way. Okay. Now we're going to get into now. Let's see. I told you earlier. Let me make sure. Yes. This was 1. So let's make this 2. Okay? And we're going to talk about this. And we're going to talk about the relation. We're going to talk about the relation of imputation to depravity. Okay? Now, I want to see if we can. Man's depravity is that sin affected his whole being. Sin had an impact. It contaminated, it affected his entire being. And this is what I want you to understand. His spirit and his body. His entire essence has been impacted, which is what we call that's what's called the depravity of man. Okay? The depravity of man. That's the impact, the consequential result of sin. Okay? So I want to look at, first thing, let's look at, we did the same thing here, so let's do it this way. Let's look at the contrast. Let's look at the contrast. Okay? Even though the guilt of sin was imputed to all mankind by way of Adam's position as the representative of the human race, this did not constitute men as corrupt. Listen to me. It did not constitute men as corrupt, or what we call depraved. Now, that's the first part. And you go, well, didn't you just say, no, hang on a second. I want you to see this with me. Because that's the second part. Now, let's make this statement. Let's make the connection now. Okay? Let's make the connection. Depravity, which is corruption, not guilt. Listen to me carefully. I want to I want to separate depravity, okay, and corruption, and I want you to see this with me, okay, and guilt. Depravity, which is corruption, but it's not guilt, results from what we're going to call hereditary solidarity, okay? Hereditary solidarity. Hereditary solidarity. Okay? And this hereditary solidarity is between Adam and all men. Adam and all men. This is where we get Romans chapter 5, verse 12 and 18 extremely clear on this issue. Now, the crescendo of this is Romans 5:14, which includes everybody else. So this is what we call hereditary solidarity. Then, there's two things that we want to do with this, okay? And we're going to do this on the point B. We're going to make this point 1, okay? And we're going to call this guilt through immediate imputation. Guilt through immediate imputation. Okay. Guilt through immediate imputation. Okay. Now, so what are we talking about here? We're talking about that we need to understand. We must understand the distinction that what we call Adamic guilt, is transmitted by direct imputation at the conception because of Adam's first sin and his position as the representative of the race. So, when I am born, remember what King David said this? Remember when King David talked about this, the psalmist in Psalm 51:5, I was conceived in sin. So when I was conceived, when I was born, I was already born in sin. It's not that my mother and father sinned in my conception, is that in my conception, it was transmitted to me the immediate guilt, okay? The Adamic guilt, okay? The guilt through immediate imputation, and this is what we would call Adamic guilt. Now, I need you to be patient with yourselves as we go through this process, because this is only the introduction to the subject. This is the very first introduction subject, and as we go on into the other courses, we really go in deeper and deeper into this issue. But for the moment, I'm just painting the highlight for you so that you begin to understand, because you're going to hear these arguments thrown about in different terms and different language, but if you listen at the core of what people are saying, you can figure out what the concepts are. So this is the first thing. Then we have a second thing called corruption. Corruption, okay? We're going to call this corruption. Okay? And this is going to be corruption through seminal procession. Okay? This is through This is going to be called corruption through seminal procession, okay? And corruption, all right, is transmitted, okay, by the seminal or what's called the Traducian process, okay? In other words, the corruption of sin comes from the parents, whereby men inherit a sin nature. So they are human beings, they produce human beings, we are made in the image of the Creator, right? We are part of creation, we are the created by the Creator. Adam and Eve being the federal representatives, when Adam and Eve, they get thrown out of the garden, they procreate, they begin to have, now they're the mother and the father of what we would call the human race, the sin nature. They now inherit a sin nature which they caused. They caused this. I want you to understand this. And now everybody who's born from them in our spiritual DNA, if you will, through the seminal process, we now have corruption. Do you understand that? So now, if you understand, and again, I ask you to be patient with yourself as we go through this process. Now I want to go back and let me see. Did I erase the back side of this? Yes, I did. So let's do this, because I might have to come back to this. And let's take this here now, and let's begin to look at a little, just a little bit more. Now we're going to go and let's make this point 3, and let's call this depravity. Let's call this depravity, okay? And now I want to look at the common views. I want to look at the common views with regard to depravity. And the reason we want to do that is because of what I said to you earlier at the beginning of this class, or I believe no, it was the previous class, which was this, that you have so many churches today. Look, the study of theology, the study of doctrine, makes absolute no sense if it has no practicality to it. This has to be applied in our daily life, in the daily life of the community of faith, in the daily life of the church. So we have to have a clear understanding of what these issues are if we're ever going to wrestle with the actual issue of sin. So when we look at this, I want you to look at some of the common views, how people think about this issue of depravity, corruption, sin, and all of the other adjectives that you want to throw in there, and all the other synonyms. But it is, by and large, dictated, it's determined by the pulpit. The pulpit in each church establishes the primary philosophical, theological glasses that you're going to see everything through, or as Dr. Fleetwood calls it, the theological grid. Okay? So I want you to see that with me. So let's look at this first one. We're going to call this the humanist. This is the humanist, and let's call this an Pelagian view. This view says that man is good. That's the view. I mean, in the most simplest of terms, that's the view. Okay? Man is basically good. Well, let's represent this correctly. Let's represent it and say man is basically, and they really focus on this part right here, basically good. Okay? Man is basically good. That's the position that they take. Okay? That the evil that's in man only gravitates to the edges, and that is what is seen on the outside. But that's not what you see on the outside of me. Is the evilness, okay? It gravitates to the edges, but the core of me, okay, is basically good. That's the basic humanistic Pelagian view, right, of depravity and the impact of of sin in a state of deprivation and corruption. Then we have a second view, and this is going to be the semi-Pelagian. The semi-Pelagian view. And that is that man is basically evil. Did you hear what I just said? We just jumped. Man is basically evil. So here we have man is basically evil. However, but his very core is good, and it can perform acts of good based on the core of goodness. And you go, well, is that double talk? Is that double speak? No, it's not. Just listen to it. Okay, now, you're asking that question with regard to Pelagian and semi-Pelagian. Let's go back and look at it very carefully so you can make the distinction. And in fact, as you make that distinction, it really shows where you are, Pastor. Listen to me, Pastor. It shows where you are in your theological grid, in your theological thought, and how you theologically and philosophically approach the scriptures, and as you teach about sin in your church. How your movement or your denomination or your church believes is determined by what you believe. So listen to this carefully. The Pelagian position is that man is basically good, and at the outer edges, I am capable of sin, I am capable of evil. In the semi-Pelagian view, man is basically evil. Do you see the flip-flop of this? But at the very core, I can do good things. The problem is here. Here's where the problem is. Remember, I said this in the last class also. I said, the problem is they never define good or goodness. There's where your problem is. Now, we're not playing games with words here. I just want you to see this with me. Because you're going to have goodness, right, as defined by man or by God. And every time you try to pin somebody down to define what that means, there's this hem-haw backpedaling. You know, they start to backpedal out of this deal, and it just like, it's almost like you ever hear somebody talk like this, and they're talking to you, and then all of a sudden they mumble, and they're and in that mumbling, what they're saying to you, well, it's God. It's God. It's the goodness of God. The goodness of God is in this man. By the way, this is also where you get the groups of people who teach you. You can be born again. You can have the power of the person of the Holy Spirit living in you, and you can also have the power of demons living in you, both taking up residence simultaneously. Henceforth, what do we get out of this? The cardinal Christian. Are we beginning now to touch the outer edges of what you may perhaps find yourself in the theological thought of your church? Now, we take a third position. Let's look at the third view. This view is called the Arminian. This is their Arminian view. Okay? The Arminian view. Okay? And he says, man is sinful. Are you beginning to see the gradations of this? Are you beginning to see this? How it develops? And this is, by the way, this is how it has developed historically. The historical account of theological positions, this is its evolvement, right? It's pretty interesting when you look at this. Man is sinful. However, he uses a funny word here. This is where the Armenian gets a little dicey, a little, it stays on the edge. And I want you to understand this. It says that man is evil, but. I'm going to insert the word but here, because he uses this phrase. Prevenient, put a T here. My penmanship means to improve greatly. But when you spend all your time on the computer, you don't write anymore. This is what happens. Okay? It's prevenient grace, and prevenient grace is a concept, okay, in which enables man, and prevenient grace is something that is taught, and you have all kinds of versions of it in the way it's taught. Again, it has to do with all the different denominations and churches and whatever the philosophical, theological grit that they're using to define terms. But by and large, here is the main one. Okay? And prevenient grace means it enables man to make righteous choices. To make righteous choices. Now, he has the ability, under this concept, he has the ability to make righteous choices. Now, if you follow the thinking here, what he's saying is that even though man is sinful, he acknowledges man is sinful. But because of prevenient grace, which is, in other words, this is issued by God, that God's grace is not affected whatsoever by man's sin or the evilness that resides in man. That grace operates independent of all of that. And so the goodness of God will be poured out upon that sinful man without any relationship to his sin. That's basically, and I want to be clear here, I want to be very clear here that there is a good portion of people who teach that way. That God's prevenient grace, okay, operates independent, and there's absolutely no relationship whatsoever to man's sinfulness. So it doesn't, in other words, put it in the vernacular, it doesn't matter what you do, God's going to be good to you anyway. God is good all the time. You begin now to think out and see why this issue of hamartology, the doctrine of sin, becomes such a big issue to study, and why it is the sixth major doctrine in the Bible. Let's now go to a fourth position. And this is the position, we're going to call this the Reformed view. So we have the humanist view, which is the Pelagian view. We have the semi-Pelagian view. We have the Armenian view. And now we have what's going to call the Reformed view. Right? That is, here, this says that man is sinful. The difference is to the core. Man is sinful to the core. And that sin has permeated It has permeated his whole being. Whereas in the Armenian position, he is still able to make righteous choices because he has not been completely permeated. So when you ask him, well, how much? 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%, 50%, 50-50, 60%? They tell you, we don't know. Well, if you don't know, then how can you make that statement? And this is where I get into the arguments where people go, well, I feel and I believe. Well, I understood why you feel and I understand why you believe. Give me the biblical perspective of it. In the Reformed position, it says that man is sinful to his very core and it permeates his whole being. He is unable to choose anything right. Okay? So under this position, he is unable to choose, okay, righteously. In this position, he is unable to choose righteously without some kind of external stimuli, just like, remember when Jesus called out for Lazarus, he said, and Lazarus was dead, and he said, Lazarus, come forth. He had to send life into a dead body in order for that dead body to be able to respond, because he could not righteously give life when he was the recipient of death. This is exactly what's taking place here. He is unable to choose righteously because his entire being has been condemned, corrupted. He is now in a complete state of corruption. So he is unable to choose anything right or even to perform acts, okay, which are pleasing to God. Man, in his raw, natural state, as he comes from the womb, is morally and spiritually, he is morally and spiritually corrupt in disposition and character. Remember when we were reading Romans chapter 5, 12, 18, and then we jump back to 14? And then to make sure we understood what the relationship was to the righteous man, which is the second Adam, we then read 15, 17, and 19. Remember that in Romans chapter 5? And so I want you to see this. Now, with this kind of brief, albeit, explanation, now let's go back and let's begin to look at something else here. No. So I'm going to go back here because this is where we're at still. And let's begin to look at, because I don't want to let go of this issue. I guess I could, but I'm choosing not to. And that is, let's begin to look at this issue of depravity. Since I've raised the issue of depravity, all right, so I want to make this point 4. So let's make depravity, because I think it's important that if we're going to go just through this logically, then I think we need to define and begin to look at some of these issues. Now, if we don't finish it here, we'll pick it up in the next class, but I do want to get it started here. So I want to look at it from a biblical perspective, okay? So let's look at it from here, and let's take this from a biblical and let's make this a biblical characterization. Okay? What is the biblical position? Again, remember earlier I told you that you have ecclesiastical interpretation, you have biblical interpretation, you have the voice of the man of God, and you have the voice of God. Let's just focus in on the voice of God in the biblical interpretation. What I have to say means absolutely nothing. It's of zero value to you. What does God have to say about the subject? Okay? So first of all, look at the biblical categorization, okay, of when we talk about depravity, because this is where we ended up with now when we began to look on the point number 3. So here, number 4, let's be very clear what this position is. A, all are sinners. All. We're not talking about 80% sinners, 85% sinners, 90% sinners, 95%, or 99.99% sinners. We're talking about, it says, all are sinners. This is the biblical perspective, the biblical categorization of the issue of depravity. So when I look at that, I'm very clear of what it says here. And the reason is because I'm told in the book of Romans in chapter 3, and I want to look at this. I want to go back to Romans chapter 3. And let's look at this in Romans chapter 3. And I want you to see in verse 9. Verse 9. Romans chapter 3, verse 9. Where it says, when he says this, what then, are we better than they? Remember the Apostle Paul. Right now I'm teaching through the book of Romans in our church. And what I want you to understand, in Romans chapter 3, specifically in verse 9, look what he says. He says, and Paul is addressing this issue head on. He makes no apologies for it, but he lays out a biblical evidence, okay, of what he's talking about here when he says, what then, verse 9, are we better than they? Are we the Jews better than the Gentiles? Are we? Right? Because they can't answer the question. I mean, they honestly can't answer the question. If you read, for example, in Romans, just back it up for the moment here, because you know what Paul is doing here? Paul is explaining. And let's see, and he's not only explaining, but to some degree, you know what Paul is doing? Paul is defending the judgment of God. Now, obviously, you and I understand that God does not need to be defended. But Paul is explaining to his audience, and in that explanation, he's defending the judgment of God, because all of chapter 2 of the book of Romans, okay, is God's case against all of the religious people, all of the church members, those who say that they believe and they profess and they boast on the law, but yet they do not live yet they do not live by the law. In other words, by the word of God. He says, so what good is it your circumcision? From that basic, what good is it your baptism? Do you follow me? So now he comes out to chapter 3. Look at this. Let's look at this in Romans chapter 3, verse 1. Then what advantages has the Jew? Or what is the benefit of circumcision? Great in every respect. First of all, that they were entrusted with the oracles of God. They got a problem already, because they were the ones who had the word of God. What then? If some did not believe, their unbelief will not nullify the faithfulness of God, will it? May it never be. Rather, let God be found true, that every man be found a liar, as it is written. And then he quotes, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. Do you see that very clearly here? There's no misunderstanding what he's talking about here whatsoever. Now, in case you know, he's quoting out of the book of Psalms. And then look at verse 5. But if our righteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? The God who inflicts wrath is not unrighteous, is he? Am I speaking in human terms? I'm speaking humanly, right? Am I speaking humanly? And then he says, may it never be, for otherwise how will God judge the world? Look at verse 7. But if through my lie the truth of God abounded to his glory, why am I also still being judged as a sinner? Verse 8. And why not say, as we are slanderously reported, and some claim that we say, let us do evil, that good may come. Their condemnation is just. This is where we get the concept from two wrongs don't make a right. Okay? Now we get to verse 9. He says, what then? Are we better? In this case, are we believers better? Are we Christians better? When Paul addressed it, are we Jews better than they? Not all, for we have already charged that both Jews and Greeks, both Jews and Gentiles, are all under sin. Are all under sin. In fact, when I go to verse 9, and I look up that word right there, where he says, in verse 9, under. We are all under sin. Let me just look at this quickly here in my Greek. Yes. Okay. When he says we are all under sin, in the Greek text, it's the word hupo. Hupo. Okay. When he says the word under here, is the word hupo, which would be hupo. Okay. And what he's saying is that we are now all under the inferior position in relationship to God. He says we are all under, this is exactly what he's saying. We are all under sin, okay? That's the position that we in. That's our condition. This is what he's talking about. All are sinners. This is the key right here. So in this model here, he's talking about that all are sinners. All. This is who we are. Now, if you go back to Romans 5:12, if you remember that in Romans 5:12, when he said this, he said, therefore, just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, so death spread to all men, because all sinned. Do you see that? So this is the biblical position, that we are all sinners. This is the categorization of biblically of the issue of depravity. All. None of you are born with a golden spoon or a silver spoon in your mouth, spiritually speaking, and you have now been set aside, set apart. You have been declared righteous, holy on your own merit, because we have none. So we have to start out with the condition of man. This is the reason why the sixth major doctrine of the Bible, sin, is so crucial to our understanding. That we start out wrong. We start out under the heavy weight of depravity. We are morally and spiritually corrupt at birth. That's the reason why Ephesians chapter 2 verse 1 says, it says that we were what? Sinners. We were dead in our transgressions, in our sins, and in our trespass.